This is the Impunity Observer podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host, publisher of the Impunity Observer, and I'm delighted today to have Olav Dirkmaat of Francisco Marroquín University in Guatemala City. He holds a PhD in economics from Rey Juan Carlos University in Spain, and he is a Netherlands or Dutch native. And we crossed paths years ago, and he's just released a wonderful new study which was weirdly timed to come out basically as soon as there were all these layoffs or cuts to USAID, and the study is very relevant to that, and particularly with the Latin American audience. So my communications intern did a review of this. Great work, Jocelyn Sanchez, and you can read this on the website. Foreign aid's self-interest is out of the closet. That's the headline. And the title of the report in English is Foreign Aid, an Ideological Hobby. And this is published through the university's Center on Public Policy Analysis, or CADEP. So, Olav, there's a lot I want to talk about this, say about this report. I want to say thank you for putting the time in to do such a, let's say, historic document. Now, why do you think there wasn't more awareness prior to you making this report and just prior to the Doge intervention into USAID regarding foreign, let's say, meddling in a place like Guatemala? Was it just how deeply understood was this issue?
It wasn't, and it didn't get any attention at all, but it makes sense from an economic point of view. I mean, we're talking about very little money for an average U.S. taxpayer. I mean, if we're talking about donations in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which would be like the equivalent of maybe $1 for each U.S. taxpayer. So it's very little money to be worried about being a U.S. voter and taxpayer, but it's a lot of money for a small country, small poor country like Guatemala. And I think the lack of oversight, the arbitrary assigning of aid by encrusted, like deep state public official that has been professionally within these kind of bureaucracies for the past 20 years. So I guess that lack of oversight comes down or boils down to it's just it's like very few dollars for our average US taxpayer. Nobody cares about countries such as Guatemala, but even like Ukraine or Romania. I mean, now it's an issue because it has been a coordinated effort by this administration to lay out all these like almost fraudulent and corrupt uses of foreign aid with one clear goal: to cut it off all, to get the bull by the horns and just get rid of these programs in their entirety. So they use this as like a kind of like propaganda, not propaganda in a bad way, but like a propaganda scheme to convince U.S. taxpayers that it's not an exception. It has been a rule that money has been wasted on these like ideological hobbies or pastime, and there was a huge misuse and corruption in these funds. So I guess the only reason that we're now worried about it is if we're seeing an active effort by Doge and by the Trump administration to get rid of it. Otherwise, we would have been in the same spot 2 years ago when I actually started writing the investigation. So 2 or 3 years ago, I started detecting certain patterns living in Guatemala, being part of civil society in Guatemala, things that an average US based citizen wouldn't care about or wouldn't like find out about. And I was living it. And as I was living it, I was detecting these patterns of like, this is really strange. Like we have these things which don't make sense, but what it make the thing that like connects the dots and makes it make sense is the money behind it. And that money is coming from a complex of foreign aid organizations with a lot of governmental money from the US, but also from Europe. Let's not forget that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that are like causing these struggles. And I started documenting, like, first of all, like, which are the organizations that are receiving foreign aid? What are they doing? And how is it shaping public policy and public opinion, and even an election in a small country like Guatemala?
Yeah. So Olaf made some very important points there that within a, let's say, representative government, there, there isn't a great deal of incentive for the man on the street to know where all his pennies are going. And like you said, we're talking about basically pennies per taxpayer when it comes to money going to Guatemala, but a few $1 million in a place like Guatemala really can have a huge impact. I don't think people realize how far that can go, considering that the average salary might be about $5,000 or $6,000 per year, right? So you can hire a heck of a lot of people for that much, for a few $1 million. And we've actually had a former USAID employee or whistleblower on the show before. His book is Masters of Corruption. So look that one up if you look back in the archives for more on that. But Olav's real addition to the mix is his application of a public choice perspective, right? So a more economically grounded perspective. So what are the insights that public choice economics, and for people who don't know the field, do you want to just clarify what that means and why it is so, I wouldn't say revolutionary, but so illuminating regarding public act behavior?
Yeah, it's basically applying just a general like economic cost benefit, like a personal incentive scheme on bureaucrats and elected officials. So of course, if you go into the public sector, you're not magically turning into some kind of angel who only cares about the common good and forgets about any personal interest in the matters. So actually, what they show is that really personal interest never goes away. You have it in private sector, but it doesn't go magically away in the public sector. So you have these incentives on a personal level, which, for instance, give rise to the budget maximizing bureaucrat. So what's in the interest of a bureaucrat? Well, he cannot have any profits. I mean, he's in public sector. He cannot earn profits. He cannot go for trying to raise his earnings and getting more resources, more money by providing a better service. No, but he has other ways of getting his personal benefit from public administration. So it means, for instance, like getting a big budget. You see this, in fact, Fergus, because the total budget of USAID has exploded. If since 2001, I think total for US foreign aid was like 15 billion dollars probably, and it is now over 60 billion dollars. So that's 4 times more over the past 25 years, and about a third of the 60 is USAID. So there's more to US foreign aid than just USAID. So the budget has gone up, but there's another thing, like a very uncomforting observation, which is that 96% of all donations of officials in US State Department, in USAID, and other government structures are almost completely to the Democrat Party, which shows there's a huge like left-wing bias in the people that are actually working in these administrations. And I think those observations, well, you have to explain it with public choice. How can it be that we have these bureaucrats who are budget maximizing, as Niskanen said? Niskanen is a great public choice theorist, but also it has this like very strong ideological component to it. And I try to explain with public choice that there's some kind of like institutional slack. So at some point, you cannot just use the increased budget for personal purposes. I mean, it's very difficult to just rob money from the US, even though we have identified certain like corruption, embezzlement of funds within foreign aid, which is very easy. You have like kickback fees, but there's a limit to it. You just can't rob it all. So within this lack of oversight, lack of accountability, lack of people caring about what you're doing, frankly, in a country such as Guatemala, but you have these millions you can assign more or less under your own discretion. You cannot just put it on your own bank account and take it to Switzerland and buy a nice mansion and a villa and have a great life. No, but there's then this money laying around which you can assign with no cost, bearing no cost at all, assigning it in one way or another way. So it gives rise to these like pastime projects where you have bureaucrats working 20 years in the same spot. They have inside information. They can control information flows. They can control the little budget for the whole US administration, but the little budget they're managing. And within that a spot, they can more or less at their own discretion assign the aid. So where they assign the aid to? Well, people they agree with, ideology. And they're not a fair representation of the ideas in the US. I mean, they're representing their own ideas, and they have the discretion and the ability to put those ideas into action, not in their own country, but in a foreign country.
Right. And just to clarify, folks, The book I mentioned before is by Mark Moyer, and the title is Masters of Corruption: How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. And that came out last year. Now, Olav just touched upon or explained a little bit this idea of public choice economics, which, as far as I know, is led by James Buchanan, who's passed away now. And people refer to it as politics without romance because there is this, yes, romantic ideal that government is this almost altruistic entity, and rather the perspective is that each of the individuals participating in this activity is acting in a self-interested manner. And yes, as you say, maybe it's not profit seeking so much, but seeking other benefits such as, yes, power, prestige, ideological advancement. And it is true that I think in the past election in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump got either 4 or 6% of the vote. So the ideological capture of the US federal government is astounding, right? It's hard, it's something to behold. Now, in the case of Guatemala, one thing that impressed me, but there must have been a lot of legwork that went into this, is how did you get all the data together to actually, because we've got one of the diagrams, it's very, it makes your eyes go all over the place trying to follow where the money goes, but how did you get all this data together and put it into a comprehensible form?
So there's a lot of like dispersed information. First of all, like the official sources like USAID or even like European aid, they're like black boxes. They really lack in transparency. And then you have like the foundations, which are also very left wing, from third, fourth generation heritage, inherited money from, for instance, Henry Ford. We have the Ford Foundation, who spends a lot of money in a small country like Guatemala. And they also have this like predominantly bias to leftist ideas. So they have better accessible information on the web, like to which organizations the money actually went. And also there's a lot of like online reports, like donor reports available. So you have annual reports where a lot of like organizations explain where they're using the money, and they use like case studies probably to convince other donors or
Yes,
to
yes.
show up their results. So there's a lot of public information available. The thing is, it's very dispersed. So it takes a lot of like time to get to the primary sources, look it all up, get a sense of where the donations went. And in some cases, for instance, you don't have the exact dates of the donations. You know which more or less in which years the grant was given, but you don't know exactly like which amount or what amount, or it has been more or less. And the sad thing is, especially in the USAID, like transparency was completely lacking. They just, in the past few years, they took everything offline. It was very difficult. They had these intermediaries, like for instance in Guatemala, which is a curious case, but there's an address in, it's not an investigation, by the way. I cannot put it in an academic document, but there's one address in Zone 14, which you probably know. Zone 14 is a very wealthy neighborhood. And it's actually a private residential neighborhood. And there's two of these intermediaries registered on the same address. And they have been receiving a lot of millions of dollars from USAID, and they're like brokers. They then trickle down the rest of the aid to other organizations, but it's a black box. I mean, we know USAID gave money to this organization of consultants or whatever, but we don't know where the money actually ended up. So that's like the whole like lack of transparency. It looks a lot like money laundering. So money laundering, you open a bunch of different corporations and different
Yeah, yeah.
limited liability corporations, then you move money from one to the other and back and forth. Well, the same thing is happening with you with foreign aid.
I would like to announce my latest book, The Latin America Red Pill: My Search for Freedom South of the Border, available in Spanish as La Píldora Roja de América Latina. This book distills 15 years of exploration and analysis and is part autobiography. If you want to get past political correctness to understand the reality on the ground, read The Latin America Red Pill. You will learn how to survive the law of the jungle, when a move to Latin America makes sense, the key to entrepreneurial success in the region, what Latin America needs to achieve development, and a whole lot more. Go to Amazon.com or click the link below to get your copy. Thank you. So basically, it's almost like you have to crowdsource the information. And you might have been aware that the Canadian version of USAID basically shut down a lot of the transparency that it had after the Doge activity with USAID took place, that that they had it basically more transparent, but then did not want people actually looking at it because before that they'd flown under the radar. Now, so yeah, the problem is, yeah, lack of transparency, you might say, corruption or blow, but also ideological capture. And how has this manifest in Guatemala? Because this is a problem where, and even here in the United States, we have these protests, and people are always asking, are these actual protesters or hired hands? So how has this manifest in the country?
Yeah, very specifically, there's actually a great case written about like Tides Foundation and Black Lives Matters in the US. And you've seen the strategy. I mean, they're paying for people to do these like blockades. I mean, Black Lives Matters was kind of a blockade. And then they also send money to prosecutors, basically to not prosecute. So the same thing is happening in Guatemala. We had protests in October 2023 when for almost 2 weeks roads were completely blocked off. We had a lot of supply issues. We had really we're hitting some kind of like wall in that sense. But it was a really small minority, which was financed in part and supported by the US Embassy, the US State Department, and USAID. So these all work together. So if you follow some accounts on the web, which is very interesting because I've written this document, Fergus, in 2023. I published it in the beginning of this year, but my intent was always to publish it in the presidential race between Biden and Trump because I thought it was like relevant information for what the Biden administration was doing in countries such as Guatemala at the time. It wasn't necessary because Trump won the election, and this was now another moment to have it out there in the open. Um, so you have these roadblocks in Guatemala, and the same thing happens. So you have these intermediary organizations which receive money from European foreign aid, and they have resources, and you can actually see it in the protests. There are people walking around who are not Guatemalans, clearly part of the foreign aid structure in Guatemala, and they encourage these kind of movement. So there's a very interesting, like you have this like general ambiguous topics according to which foreign aid is assigned. So for instance, like worst is probably gender kind of stuff, like LGBT is one of these like topics, but there's others like corruption, democracy, civil society, I know women rights, indigenous rights. So these are like the general topics. But then with the brokers, they sign up, of course, to their ideological friends. So they're not going to give money to a right-wing indigenous organization. They're going to give money to a left-wing indigenous organization. So just to give an example, I've seen at least like 40 indigenous women organizations that receive very little money for maybe a US taxpayer or even like a regular US worker. So these are like grants in the about like $100,000 a grant for each organization, which is not that much money for an organization. And but they have like 40 of them. And then you say, well, what are they doing really? Well, we have no idea what they're doing. But what we know is that whenever there's like a very important point in Guatemalan politics, like something very transcending, like very important, like this, you have this once a year or a few times a year, if this like days, specific days where really those days really shape the future of the country politically. And in those moments, you saw like a complete coordination. So, for instance, of these 40 organizations in different parts of the country, and all with their social media and all with their accounts and on Facebook, they were actually reading a declaration, and you could see, I've seen few of them in live, you could see they didn't understand the words that were written in the declarations. Somebody gave them a script. They had to read off the script in front of a camera and publish it and try to push in their communities for people supporting the blockades, whatever the way they could do it. And they didn't even understand the words they were reading. So this is like the kind of coordination we see. So there's in those moments, they're basically asking, demanding like ideological alignment from all of their organizations that receive funds directly or indirectly from the brokers or from the people that actually pay for the aid, like the U.S. government.
Essentially, what you're saying is that the United States and other foreign aid delivering organizations and nations are exporting their culture wars to Guatemala. And as you know, it's very strange to see these issues prominent in Guatemala when they're just not really popular, right? And because they'll finance them in almost like a decentralized or very microfinancing fashion, it makes it seem like it's kind of like organic or bottom up when it's really not. Okay, so this, I mean, and I want to repeat the point that you don't have to spend a huge amount of money in these places to really push the dial because a lot of Guatemalans are just on subsistence incomes and they're not really participating in politics. They're just getting on with their day-to-day lives. And so, but if you can hire I don't know, a few thousand people, that can really make a bang in the country, make an impact. Now, so this is from CADEP is the acronym for the organization, and in Spanish it's La Ayuda Extranjera como Pasatiempo Ideológico. So just foreign aid as an ideological pastime or hobby. This is the publication in Spanish, and it's for the now it is a kind of complicated Spanish name. We just called it the Public Policy Analysis Center. And so we've been speaking with Olav Dirkmaat, the lead author of this report, which is really a historic document that deserves to be given more attention. We also have a review on our own website. So, Olav, any final remarks or what you're going to do from this point on with this information now? Was there a next step with this material?
No, I'm just an academic, so it's mostly like laying bare whatever is happening in Guatemala and how it influenced the narrative, popular talking points, words, customs, priorities, and but also later elections. So I think in the past elections there was severe U.S. interference, both in a propaganda kind of way, but also in excluding certain participants in the national election, presidential election.
Right.
And you can actually
Yeah.
see, so part of the study is I've shown that places, cities in Guatemala that are better connected to the internet were more susceptible or more influenced by the foreign aid like pushed narratives. So these are like empty narratives. They're words that are supposed to be have like an emotional context attached to them, and that's the way they try to influence the narrative. So, for instance, like words of like the pact of the corrupt, or kleptocracy, or a failed democracy, or Guatemala, you will flourish. So, or they won't silence us, which was coordinated by Internews, by the way, which is in a scandal involving USAID and now in the US. Well, they were in Guatemala and they were influencing the narrative in Guatemala. So basically, the next step would be none, but I would really suggest to the people to read the document and be very skeptic whenever they hear a story about a country such as Guatemala without having boots on the ground. So there's a lot of like narrative building, these empty phrases about corruption, empty phrases about attacks against democracy, which if you take a closer look at what's really happening, it's not even close to what these like empty phrases are trying to suggest. So a lot of information that's coming out of Guatemala will be biased, will be influenced by this foreign aid network. It doesn't stop with USAID. I mean, USAID was a small, relatively small amount of the total aid that goes to these countries. So just to be very skeptical whenever they hear stories, very crafted stories, words, phrases, just to be skeptical of whatever's coming out of these countries.
Yeah, in some ways, it's funny we talk about what the implications might be because, as you say, you're an academic describing what is actually happening without necessarily giving judgment. But so you could see from a more progressive or leftist mindset, you might say, we're just helping to build the right values in these countries and these organizations are doing their job, right? Now, but on the other hand, the response would be if you were Guatemalan, you would say, what are these foreigners doing here? And we've got to be, like you said, more skeptical. I do wonder whether the likes of the Canadian and European Union foreign aid agencies will find their wings clipped in the future. Do you think there's any hunger for that? Will there be a kind of Dodge equivalent of this is speculation, but yeah.
No, I do think like the US has a very positive influence in that way in the Trump administration. Just to give you a quick example, my native country, the Netherlands, actually slashed foreign aid by 1/3, which is not Doge, but I mean, 1/3 is something.
Wow.
And they're also
Yeah.
changing the strategy. So why would the Netherlands be giving out aid in a country as Guatemala, which strategically for the Dutch taxpayer, because let's remember, this is Dutch taxpayer money. It's not a voluntary donation by a concerned Dutch citizen. No, this is state money. And they're actually rerouting the foreign aid to more strategical places. Like, for instance, the Netherlands receives a lot of immigrants or refugees from, I don't know, Syria or Eritrea in Africa. So why not focus foreign aid where it might make a difference, for instance, in migration flows? So countries, not just the US, but also European countries, will start to look at foreign aid more strategically in their other domestic objectives. And I think we also see, after years and years and decades of increases, we will see maybe a pushback against foreign aid, especially with more right-wing politicians winning elections in Europe and maybe in Canada.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's likely in the next month or two. We'll have to wait and see. And we won't get into it now, but maybe in the future you could examine the former Dutch colonies of the Americas, right? So you do have Suriname and some in the Caribbean. I'm really not an expert on them, to be frank, but there is a Dutch legacy there. So you can follow Olav on X, Olav Dirkmaat. We'll have all the links in the show notes. And I want to just say, Olav, I obviously respect your work and appreciate what you've done here, bringing this to public attention. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Fergus.